Not a great while ago, passing through the Gate of Dreams, I visited that region of the earth in which lies the famous City of Destruction. It interested me much to learn that by the public spirit of some of the inhabitants, a railroad had recently been established between this populous and flourishing town and the Celestial City. Having a little time upon my hands, I resolved to gratify a liberal curiosity by making a trip thither. Accordingly, one fine morning after paying my bill at the hotel and directing the porter to stow my luggage behind a coach, I took my seat in the vehicle and set out for the station house. It was my good fortune to enjoy the company of a gentleman, one Mr. Smooth-It-Away, who, though he had never actually visited the Celestial City, yet seemed as well acquainted with its laws, customs, policy, and statistics, as with those of the City of Destruction, of which he was a native townsman. Our coach rattled out of the city, and at a short distance from its outskirts passed over a bridge of elegant construction, but somewhat too slight, as I imagined, to sustain any considerable weight. "This," remarked Mr. Smooth-It-Away with a casual wave of his hand, "is the famous Slough of Despond, a disgrace to all the neighborhood, and the greater that it might so easily be converted into firm ground. I have understood that efforts have been made for that purpose from time immemorial. Bunyan mentions that above 20,000 cartloads of wholesome instructions had been thrown in here without effect." "Very probably. And what effect could be anticipated from such unsubstantial stuff?" Mr. Smooth-It-Away declared with a dismissive tone. "You observe this convenient bridge. We obtained a sufficient foundation for it by throwing into the slough some editions of books of morality, volumes of French philosophy and German rationalism, tracts, sermons, and essays of modern clergymen." It really seemed to me, however, that the bridge vibrated and heaved up and down in a rather formidable manner. Despite Mr. Smooth-It-Away's confidence about its foundation, I felt rather uneasy about crossing it in a crowded omnibus. Nevertheless, we got over without accident and soon found ourselves at the station house. This very neat and spacious edifice stood on the site of the little wicket gate, which formerly, as all old pilgrims will recollect, stood directly across the highway. A large number of passengers were already at the station house awaiting the departure of the cars, I observed with interest. The scene before me was quite different from what Bunyan had described in his time. Instead of a lonely and ragged man with a huge burden on his back, plodding along sorrowfully on foot while the whole city hooted after him, here were parties of the first gentry and most respectable people in the neighborhood, setting forth towards the Celestial City as cheerfully as if the pilgrimage were merely a summer tour. "One great convenience of the new method of going on pilgrimage," he said with satisfaction, "I must not forget to mention. Our enormous burdens, instead of being carried on our shoulders as had been the custom of old, were all snugly deposited in the baggage car and, as I was assured, would be delivered to their respective owners at the journey's end." "Where is Mr. Greatheart?" I inquired, looking around expectantly. "Beyond a doubt the directors have engaged that famous old champion to be chief conductor on the railroad?" "Why, no," said Mr. Smooth-It-Away with a dry cough. "He was offered the situation of brakeman. But, to tell you the truth, our friend Greatheart has grown preposterously stiff and narrow in his old age. The engine at this moment took its station in advance of the cars. I must confess it looked much more like a sort of mechanical demon that would hurry us to the infernal regions than a laudable contrivance for smoothing our way to the Celestial City." "Do my eyes deceive me?" I cried with alarm. "What on earth is this? A living creature? If so, he is own brother to the engine he rides upon." "Po, you are obtuse," said Mr. Smooth-It-Away with a hearty laugh. "Don't you know Apollyon, Christian's old enemy, with whom he fought so fierce a battle in the Valley of Humiliation? He was the very fellow to manage the engine." The passengers being all comfortably seated, we now rattled away merrily, accomplishing a greater distance in 10 minutes than Christian probably trudged over in a day. It was laughable, while we glanced along as it were at the tail of a thunderbolt, to observe 2 dusty foot travelers in the old pilgrim guise with cockleshell and staff, their mystic rolls of parchment in their hands, and their intolerable burdens on their backs. Our wiser brotherhood greeted these two pilgrims with many pleasant jibes and a roar of laughter. They merely gazed back at us with such woeful and absurdly compassionate visages that our merriment grew tenfold more obstreperous. Apollyon also entered heartily into the fun, contriving to flirt the smoke and flame of the engine into their faces, enveloping them in an atmosphere of scalding steam. These little practical jokes amused us mightily. At some distance from the railroad, Mr. Smooth-It-Away pointed to a large antique edifice. That was a tavern of long standing and had formerly been a noted stopping place for pilgrims. In Bunyan's road book, it is mentioned as the Interpreter's House. I have long had a curiosity to visit that old mansion, I remarked thoughtfully. It is not one of our stations, as you perceive, said my companion with a slight smirk. The keeper was violently opposed to the railroad, and well he might be, as the track left his house of entertainment on one side, and thus was pretty certain to deprive him of all his reputable customers. Before our talk on this subject came to a conclusion, we were rushing by the place where Christian's burden fell from his shoulders at the sight of the cross. This served as a theme for Mr. Smooth-It-Away and his companions to descant upon the inestimable advantages resulting from the safety of our baggage. Thus pleasantly conversing, we soon found ourselves at the foot of the hill Difficulty. Through the very heart of this rocky mountain, a tunnel had been constructed of most admirable architecture, with a lofty arch and a spacious double track. "This is a wonderful improvement indeed," said I, my voice echoing in the tunnel. Yet I should have been glad of an opportunity to visit the Palace Beautiful and be introduced to the charming young ladies, Miss Prudence, Miss Piety, Miss Charity, and the rest, who have the kindness to entertain pilgrims there. "Young ladies!" cried Mr. Smooth-It-Away as soon as he could speak for laughing. "And charming young ladies! Why, my dear fellow, they are old maids, every soul of them, prim, starched, dry, and angular," he said mockingly. The respectable Apollyon was now putting on the steam at a prodigious rate, anxious, perhaps, to get rid of the unpleasant reminiscences connected with the spot where he had so disastrously encountered Christian. Consulting Mr. Bunyan's road book, I perceived that we must now be within a few miles of the Valley of the Shadow of Death, into which doleful region, at our present speed, we should plunge much sooner than seemed at all desirable. In truth, I expected nothing better than to find myself in the ditch on one side or the quag on the other, but on communicating my apprehensions to Mr. Smooth-It-Away, he assured me that the difficulties of this passage had been vastly exaggerated. Even while we were speaking, the train shot into the entrance of this dreaded valley. Though I plead guilty to some foolish palpitations of the heart during our headlong rush over the causeway, I couldn't help but marvel at the boldness of its construction. For the everlasting gloom, they had ingeniously collected the inflammable gas which exudes from the soil, feeding it through pipes to a quadruple row of lamps along the whole extent of the passage. Thus, a radiance had been created even out of the fiery and sulphurous curse that rests forever upon the valley, a radiance hurtful to the eyes and somewhat bewildering, as I discovered by the changes which it wrought in the visages of my companions. Just as some dismal fooleries of this nature had made my heart quake, he whispered nervously, there came a tremendous shriek, careering along the valley as if 1,000 devils had burst their lungs to utter it. The spot where we had now paused is the same that our friend Bunyan, a truthful man, but infected with many fantastic notions, has designated in terms plainer than I like to repeat, as the mouth of the infernal region. This, Mr. Smooth-It-Away assured us confidently, is no other than the crater of a half-extinct volcano in which the directors had caused forges to be set up for the manufacture of railroad iron. The inhabitants of the cavern were unlovely personages, dark, smoke-begrimed, generally deformed, with misshapen feet, and a glow of dusky redness in their eyes as if their hearts had caught fire and were blazing out of the upper windows. Among the idlers about the train, I noticed several who, to my certain knowledge, had heretofore set forth by railroad for the Celestial City. They looked dark, wild, and smoky, with a singular resemblance to the native inhabitants. "Did you not start," said I to one such person, an indolent fellow named Take It Easy, for the Celestial City? "That's a fact," he replied carelessly, puffing some smoke into my eyes. "But I heard such bad accounts that I never took pains to climb the hill on which the city stands. No business doing, no fun going on, nothing to drink, and no smoking allowed," he said with disdain. While he was speaking, the bell of the engine rang, and we dashed away after dropping a few passengers, but receiving no new ones. Rattling onward through the valley, we were dazzled with the fiercely gleaming gas lamps as before. But sometimes, in the dark of intense brightness, grim faces seemed to thrust themselves through the veil of light, glaring upon us and stretching forth a great dusky hand as if to impede our progress. I almost thought that they were my own sins that appalled me there. As the light of natural day began to struggle with the glow of the lanterns, these vain imaginations lost their vividness and finally vanished with the first ray of sunshine that greeted our escape from the valley of the shadow of death. At the end of the valley, as John Bunyan mentions, is a cavern where, in his days, dwelt two cruel giants, Pope and Pagan. These vile old troglodytes are no longer there, but into their deserted cave another terrible giant has thrust himself. He is a German by birth, and is called Giant Transcendentalist. But as to his form, his features, his substance, and his nature generally, it is the chief peculiarity of this huge miscreant that neither he for himself, nor anybody for him, has ever been able to describe them. It was late in the day when the train thundered into the ancient city of Vanity, where Vanity Fair is still at the height of prosperity and exhibits an epitome of whatever is brilliant, gay, and fascinating beneath the sun. "As I purpose to make a considerable stay here," he said thoughtfully, "it gratified me to learn that there is no longer the want of harmony between the town's people and pilgrims, which impelled the former to such lamentably mistaken measures as the persecution of Christian and the fiery martyrdom of faithful. Indeed, such are the charms of Vanity Fair that people often affirm it to be the true and only heaven, stoutly contending that there is no other, that those who seek further are mere dreamers." Being naturally of a serious turn, my attention was directed to the solid advantages derivable from a residence here. Almost every street has its church, and the reverend clergy are nowhere held in higher respect than at Vanity Fair. During my stay, I observed the various sorts of traffic going forward. Some of the purchasers made very foolish bargains indeed. "For instance," he said with a touch of sadness, "a young man having inherited a splendid fortune, laid out a considerable portion of it in the purchase of diseases, and finally spent all the rest for a heavy lot of repentance and a suit of rags. There was a sort of stock or scrip called conscience which seemed to be in great demand and would purchase almost anything. Yet as this stock was the only thing of permanent value, whoever parted with it was sure to find himself a loser in the long run. Prince Beelzebub himself took great interest in this sort of traffic," he observed quietly. "I once had the pleasure to see him bargaining with a miser for his soul, which, after much ingenious skirmishing on both sides, His Highness succeeded in obtaining at about the value of 6 pence. One day, amid the bustle of Vanity, I encountered the same pair of simple pilgrims at whom we had laughed so heartily when Apollyon puffed smoke and steam into their faces at the commencement of our journey. "Sir," inquired one of them, his name was Stick to the Right, with a sad yet mild and kindly voice, "do you call yourself a pilgrim?" "Yes," I replied confidently. "My right to that appellation is indubitable. I am merely a sojourner here in Vanity Fair, being bound to the Celestial City by the new railroad." "Alas, friend, I do assure you, and beseech you to receive the truth of my words, that whole concern is a bubble. You may travel on it all your lifetime, were you to live thousands of years, and yet never get beyond the limits of Vanity Fair. Finally, after a pretty long residence at the fair, I resumed my journey towards the Celestial City, still with Mr. Smooth-It-Away at my side. At a short distance beyond the suburbs of Vanity, we passed the ancient silver mine, of which Damus was the first discoverer, and which is now wrought to great advantage, supplying nearly all the coined currency of the world. The next remarkable object was a large edifice, constructed of moss-grown stone, but in a modern and airy style of architecture. The engine came to a pause in its vicinity, with the usual tremendous shriek. "This was formerly the castle of the redoubted giant Despair," observed Mr. Smooth-It-Away with a light tone. "But since his death, Mr. Flimsy Faith has repaired it, and keeps an excellent house of entertainment here." Soon we entered the pleasant land of Beulah. All the passengers were rubbing their eyes, comparing watches, and congratulating one another on the prospect of arriving so seasonably at the journey's end. Looking to ascertain what might be the occasion of this glad harmony, I perceived, on alighting from the cars, that a multitude of shining ones had assembled on the other side of the river to welcome two poor pilgrims who were just emerging from its depths. "How amazingly well those men have got on," I cried to Mr. Smooth-It-Away. "I wish we were secure of as good a reception." Looking back to the shore, I was amazed to discern Mr. Smooth-It-Away waving his hand in token of farewell. "Don't you go over to the Celestial City?" I exclaimed with surprise. "Oh no," he answered with a queer smile, and that same disagreeable contortion of visage. "Oh no, I have come thus far only for the sake of your pleasant company. Goodbye, we shall meet again." The wheels threw a dash of spray over me so cold, so deadly cold, with the chill that will never leave those waters until death be drowned in his own river, that with a shiver and a heartquake I awoke. Thank heaven it was a dream.